The day had arrived that Prince Harry had been dreading, though no one outside his closest circle could have predicted how deeply it would cut. Imagine this: a royal prince, once adored by millions, now sitting alone in the echoing halls of his private London residence, staring at a court notice that would alter the course of his life forever. The ink was barely dry, the letterhead still crisp, yet the words on the page felt like a hammer to his chest. The UK royal court had ruled. His return to Britain was blocked, indefinitely. A simple, legal sentence on paper, but the weight of it resonated with all the power of a betrayal he couldn't see coming. How could this happen? How had it escalated to this point? From casual rumors and whispered tensions to an irrevocable legal blockade that seemed, to Harry, not just bureaucratic, but deeply personal. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The world, as he knew it, was shrinking. Every plan to return, every fleeting hope of reconnecting with family, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The palace, the media, and the courts all seemed aligned in a way that made him question the very foundations of the life he had known. And yet, there was something more than the legal text itself gnawing at him. It was the silence behind the words, the cold, calculated distance that seemed to stretch between him and the people he had once called family. The judge's ruling didn't just block travel, it sent a signal. It was a warning, a statement, a declaration: your presence is no longer welcome. As Harry read the ruling, memories came flooding back. Moments he had shared with his father, his brother, the public appearances, the cheers, the flashes of cameras, the palpable weight of expectation on his shoulders. They were all now memories, relics of a life that felt increasingly distant. He could see himself, years ago, walking into Buckingham Palace for a ceremony, a smile plastered on his face, waving to adoring crowds. Then came the media frenzy, the invasive scrutiny, the tabloid headlines that seemed designed to shred his very identity. And now, the law itself seemed to have taken sides in a drama he never auditioned for, a narrative where he was cast as the outsider, the exile, the prince who could no longer set foot on his own soil without encountering an unyielding legal wall. The question that lingered in his mind, one that he dared not vocalize even to himself at first, was the hardest to face. Why now? Why block him so decisively at this particular moment? The timing was brutal. Just as he had been negotiating philanthropic initiatives, public engagements, and even private trips to reconnect with parts of the country that had once been his home, the court's decision landed like a thunderclap. The timing wasn't just inconvenient. It felt orchestrated, almost theatrical in its precision. And as any public figure knows, timing is everything. The optics of the situation would be scrutinized worldwide. Headlines would scream betrayal, exile, and heartbreak. And Harry, despite the years of public scrutiny he had endured, felt the sting in a way that no media training, no royal poise, could buffer. But let's pause for a moment and ask, what does this ruling really mean for Harry, for the monarchy, and for the millions of people who have watched this royal saga unfold? Because this isn't just a legal matter. It's an emotional earthquake with tremors felt across continents. The decision doesn't merely prevent travel, it disrupts relationships, rewrites narratives, and challenges the very concept of belonging. How do you reconcile the love for a country with the feeling of being formally turned away from it? How do you explain to the public, to friends, and to the world that a place you've called home is no longer legally yours to visit? These are questions that gnaw at the human psyche, questions that don't have neat answers, and questions that make the next steps fraught with uncertainty. In the hours following the ruling, Harry reportedly moved from room to room in his residence, trying to process what had just happened. Legal counsel had given their input, carefully dissecting the ruling paragraph by paragraph, but it didn't soften the blow. The document was clear, unambiguous, and final. Every clause, every subsection, seemed deliberately designed to close doors permanently. He tried to distract himself with work, with charitable planning, with conversations with his closest confidants. But even these attempts felt hollow, tinged with a shadow of inevitability. The heart of the matter was not what the ruling allowed him to do, but what it refused: the chance to return to a country that was intertwined with his very identity, physically and emotionally. And then came the media storm. Headlines exploded across social platforms, news networks, and tabloids alike. Every article, every tweet, every broadcast seemed to carry the same sentiment. Prince Harry denied return to UK forever. The phrasing was merciless, each syllable loaded with drama and judgment. Public reaction was instant and polarized. Supporters of the prince decried the ruling as cruel and disproportionate. Critics called it a necessary step in maintaining royal protocols. And through it all, Harry sat in quiet despair, the spotlight of the world simultaneously illuminating his every move and isolating him in a way that no one outside his inner circle could fully comprehend. In that moment, he was both hypervisible and profoundly alone. Now, imagine the tension building as Harry contemplates what comes next. He's not just a royal figure. He's a husband, a father, a philanthropist, and, above all, a human being facing rejection from a homeland that was once a cornerstone of his identity. Every plan, every hope, every attempt at reconciliation feels fraught with obstacles, both legal and emotional. The narrative that is unfolding is nothing short of Shakespearean in its complexity. Love and loyalty tested, familial bonds strained, public perception in turmoil. And just when you think the story has reached its emotional peak, there's always another layer. Another twist waiting to upend everything, another secret, another revelation, another heartbreak just around the corner. Which brings us to the question that will hang over the rest of this story. How does a man, raised in privilege yet thrust into relentless scrutiny, navigate a life where even the place he calls home becomes off-limits? Can resilience alone bridge the gap between law and loyalty? And what unforeseen developments lie ahead? Developments that could completely overturn the trajectory of this drama, leaving audiences stunned, shocked, and emotionally invested. Because, make no mistake, the saga is far from over. The legal ruling is only the opening act in a drama that promises twists, betrayals, revelations, and emotional moments that will challenge everything we thought we knew about the prince, his family, and the very institution that shaped him. But here's the twist. While the world watches, unaware of what is truly happening behind closed doors, a quiet storm is brewing. There are conversations happening, alliances forming, and decisions being made that could either reinforce Harry's isolation or, conversely, set the stage for a shocking turnaround. And that is where we leave the introduction, with Harry facing a crossroad no one predicted, a moment heavy with uncertainty and fraught with peril. One thing is certain. The next moves will not just determine his future, they will ripple through the monarchy, the media, and the public imagination, leaving questions that demand answers. And the next chapter, already in motion, promises revelations that will make everything that came before pale in comparison. The scene is set, the players are in place, and the stakes could not be higher. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the ruling landed in Harry's hands, it was as though time slowed. Have you ever had an instant where the world seems to tilt on its axis, and everything you thought was certain suddenly feels like sand slipping through your fingers? That's exactly how he felt. The court's decision wasn't just a no, it was a resounding, formal, and public stay away. The words on the page, cold and precise, conveyed a finality that felt almost cruel. Every sentence seemed loaded with judgment, each paragraph a reminder that his position in the country he once called home was no longer secure. From the outside looking in, it might appear bureaucratic, a matter of legal procedure. But for Harry, it was deeply personal. A crown isn't just a symbol, it's a weight. And for him, that weight had shifted overnight. The palace, once a backdrop to his childhood adventures and ceremonial milestones, now seemed to loom over him with a mix of authority and silent reproach. Imagine walking into a room where every picture, every gilded frame, every whisper of history serves as a reminder that you are now, officially, unwelcome. That was his reality. Almost immediately, the news erupted online. Headlines screamed with words designed to shock and provoke. Prince Harry blocked forever from UK. Royal court bans Duke's return. Exile or justice? The public weighs in. The social media world lit up like a fireworks display gone out of control, with opinions, memes, and theories flooding every platform. Supporters were vocal. expressing outrage at what they called a draconian measure, while critics argued that this was the inevitable outcome of someone who had distanced themselves from the institution that shaped them. In a single day, Harry went from a man planning his next steps to a figure at the center of a storm whose intensity was impossible to ignore. But what happened in the private chambers of his residence was far more telling than public outrage. He sat in silence for hours, staring at the ruling, feeling the words embed themselves in his mind. It wasn't just the impossibility of returning. It was the understanding that relationships he had taken for granted were suddenly fragile, perhaps even irreparable. The concept of family became complicated, not because of resentment or anger alone, but because the structures of authority and expectation had shifted, leaving him in a liminal space where he belonged neither here nor there. How do you reconcile love for your family with a reality in which the law explicitly tells you that your presence is unwelcome? Then came the practical implications. Every plan for upcoming visits, every potential public appearance, every charitable engagement linked to the UK suddenly evaporated. Invitations were rescinded, schedules altered, and advisors scrambled to reconfigure future projects. He had to consider alternative strategies, projects abroad, partnerships outside the monarchy's influence, media appearances in other countries. But each felt like a stopgap, a way to fill the void left by a nation that now felt legally and emotionally distant. And yet, the legal decision itself was only the surface. There were layers of tension underneath that no one outside the palace would ever see. Conversations behind closed doors, subtle looks exchanged during ceremonies, whispers in the hallways, all painted a picture of a family fractured by more than just distance. There was resentment, sure. But there was also fear, misunderstanding, and the crushing weight of centuries of tradition. Harry's position, complicated as it already was, became even more precarious as alliances shifted quietly in his absence. Imagine chess pieces moving while the player isn't watching. Each decision in another room could affect your future without your knowledge. That is exactly what was happening to him. But here's the part that few people realize. Public perception and private reality often collide in unpredictable ways. In the media, Harry's story was simplified into binaries: exile, rebellion, tragedy. In reality, each day was a negotiation of emotions, relationships, and strategic choices. He had to manage his own heartbreak while navigating public scrutiny and legal constraints. Could he ever return without violating the court's ruling? Could he maintain relevance in a country where his physical presence was now barred? And how would he reconcile the love for his children, who were still tied to the UK, with the impossibility of sharing certain experiences with them on their home soil? These questions were not just abstract. They demanded answers, and answers were hard to find when every option seemed fraught with obstacles. As the days progressed, Harry began to notice subtle signs that the palace was reinforcing boundaries. Invitations to family events arrived later than usual or were omitted entirely. Public statements, carefully worded and neutral on the surface, hinted at disapproval. Even friendly correspondence felt constrained, measured, and distant. It was almost as if the ruling was not merely a legal decision but a signal: we acknowledge you, but we will not welcome you. The psychological toll of this realization was profound. It was one thing to read words on a page. It was another to live them in the body, to feel the weight of invisible barriers pressing against every decision you make. But Harry is nothing if not resilient. He began strategizing, thinking several steps ahead. Advisors, old friends, and select confidants became lifelines. Discussions about media ventures, philanthropic projects, and alternative avenues of influence intensified. He realized that even without the ability to return to the UK, his life was far from over. Influence, impact, and public engagement could exist in other forms, through global initiatives, virtual events, and collaborations abroad. Still, every plan carried a shadow of limitation, a reminder of doors that had been closed, and opportunities that might never come. And just when the tension seemed almost unbearable, there were whispers of internal palace disagreements. Sources suggested that not everyone in the family agreed with the harshness of the ruling, that debates had taken place behind closed doors about whether such a permanent blockade was fair or necessary. But these disagreements were invisible to the public eye, leaving Harry to wonder who truly supported him and who had decided, quietly and irrevocably, that he would remain an outsider. Then came the hardest part, reconciling emotion with strategy. Public figures must constantly balance the heart against the optics, and Harry was no exception. How do you mourn a lost homeland while maintaining your public image? How do you express vulnerability without inviting criticism or assert independence without seeming defiant? The court's ruling created a perfect storm of conflicting pressures, each demanding attention, each threatening to tip the balance. And as Harry wrestled with these realities, he had to acknowledge the painful truth. His life as he had known it in the UK, the spontaneity, the comfort, the familiarity, was gone. It had been replaced by an unyielding legal reality, a media narrative that simplified his story, and the silent, subtle distance of family he could no longer reach. In the midst of this emotional chaos, one thought kept resurfacing. What would happen next? The ruling was final, yes, but life is never static. Decisions can be revisited, alliances can shift, and circumstances can change. Was there a path back, or had the gates truly closed forever? The uncertainty was maddening. Every legal option seemed complex. Every public statement had to be calculated, and every move carried risk. It was a game of high stakes, a game with the entire world watching, with every misstep magnified, and with consequences that could reverberate for generations. And then, as Harry prepared to make his next move, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred behind the palace walls. A development that could change the entire dynamic, a ripple in the current that had been assumed steady and immovable. But what it was, and how it would impact Harry's future, remained a secret. One thing was certain, nothing about this story was over. In fact, the next act promised revelations that would stun the public, challenge assumptions, and leave every observer questioning what they thought they knew about loyalty, family, and power. And that's where Chapter 1 leaves us. Harry, isolated yet resilient, facing a world where legal decrees and family dynamics collide, and a storm of unprecedented consequences is quietly forming just beyond the horizon. The stage is set, but the next move, whether it would bring reconciliation, escalation, or further heartbreak, remained uncertain. But what came next would shatter expectations, and no one, not even Harry, could predict the full impact of the forces about to converge. The palace had always been a world apart, a labyrinth of marble halls, gilded ceilings, and centuries of tradition. But for Harry, it had recently become a place of uncertainty, a maze where every corridor seemed to echo with whispers and every shadow could conceal a secret. While the public focused on headlines, the real drama was unfolding behind closed doors, a realm invisible to cameras, tabloids, and public opinion. And it was here, in these hidden corners, that the seeds of tension, alliances, and betrayal were quietly taking root. From the moment the court's decision was announced, subtle shifts began to occur. Advisors who had once been neutral were now taking sides, measuring loyalty not just to Harry as an individual, but to the institution that shaped him. Imagine a room where every handshake, every glance, every carefully chosen word carries a hidden meaning. This is the world Harry now inhabited. In such an environment, trust is fragile. Even those closest to you can become part of the chessboard, moving in ways that serve strategy rather than affection. One of the first shocks came in the form of private communications. Messages that had once flowed freely from family members were now carefully edited, delayed, and in some cases, conspicuously absent. It was as if invisible barriers had been erected, not by law but by silent, calculated human behavior. Every interaction carried weight, every misstep was potentially a headline, and every word had to be measured against the unforgiving scrutiny of both media and monarchy. Harry, who had spent years learning to navigate public life, found himself suddenly unarmed in a new kind of battlefield, the quiet, invisible war of influence and proximity. And then there were the whispers, rumors, hints, and veiled conversations about loyalty, discretion, and allegiance. Some palace insiders hinted that the court's ruling had not been as spontaneous as it appeared. There were suggestions of premeditation, debates that had stretched behind closed doors, and even quiet campaigns to influence public perception. Imagine discovering that decisions which would define your freedom, your identity, and your relationships had been discussed without your knowledge, in rooms you could not enter. The emotional impact was profound. Feelings of betrayal are complicated, especially when they are intertwined with love, respect, and family history. Harry felt that sting acutely. But amid the tension, there were also whispers of potential support. Not everyone within the palace walls was aligned against him. Some quietly sympathized, recognizing the human cost of the ruling and the complexity of his situation. Yet, even support came with caveats. It was cautious, measured, and often hidden behind layers of discretion. The dynamics were subtle and complex. Alliances formed not from emotion alone, but from calculation, and every gesture carried an unspoken message. In this delicate ecosystem, even the most seemingly trivial action could ripple outward, affecting perception, loyalty, and opportunity. Meanwhile, Harry's legal team was working tirelessly, dissecting every clause, paragraph, and implication of the ruling. They explored potential loopholes, reconsidered past agreements, and even drafted contingencies for international negotiations. But despite their efforts, the ruling remained formidable. Legal language is a precise and often cold instrument. It doesn't account for emotion, history, or sentiment. It simply imposes boundaries. For Harry, that meant confronting not only external obstacles, but also internal conflict, reconciling the rational strategies suggested by counsel with the emotional reality of being barred from a homeland that had shaped him. As he processed these developments, Harry began to notice subtle patterns in behavior. Certain advisors were suddenly more attentive, others more distant. Invitations to speak or participate were carefully curated, sometimes offered, sometimes withheld. Even the public statements from family members seemed layered with unspoken commentary. Phrases that sounded neutral on the surface but hinted at disapproval or caution beneath. For someone trained to read nuance, the message was unmistakable. While the door had been legally closed, the palace was also signaling its social and emotional boundaries. And in such a world, perception is power. One of the more shocking realizations for Harry was how rapidly narratives were being shaped outside his control. Media outlets, eager for stories of royal drama, picked up the smallest morsels of information and amplified them into global spectacles. Every social media post, every interview snippet, every offhand remark was dissected, analyzed, and presented in ways that reinforced the image of isolation and despair. It was a reminder that public perception often diverges dramatically from reality, and that managing one's image becomes an exercise in constant vigilance. Even acts of kindness or moments of personal reflection could be twisted into headlines suggesting weakness, anger, or defiance. And yet, despite the pressures, Harry remained strategic. He understood that resilience in such circumstances required not only emotional fortitude, but also meticulous planning. Meetings with advisors became intense brainstorming sessions, exploring pathways that could protect his public image, sustain his initiatives, and maintain influence in the UK from afar. He considered alternative channels, philanthropic partnerships, global media engagements, and digital platforms, all designed to circumvent the limitations imposed by the ruling. But even these options were fraught with risk. Every move could be scrutinized, every strategy could backfire, and every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. At the same time, the human cost of isolation became increasingly apparent. Personal relationships, previously taken for granted, began to strain under the weight of distance, expectation, and misunderstanding. Friends offered advice, comfort, and solidarity, but even their support was tinged with caution. The reality of living in the public eye makes every association potentially consequential. Family ties, particularly those connected to the monarchy, became even more complex. How do you maintain loyalty to people who have, in effect, placed you outside their immediate sphere of influence? How do you reconcile love and duty when structural and legal barriers enforce separation? These were questions that haunted Harry, as they would anyone suddenly confronted with the fragility of familial bonds. Then there were moments of sheer human frustration, private outbursts that no one would witness, but which revealed the depth of his despair. Imagine pacing a room late at night, legal documents spread across a table, phone messages blinking unanswered, and the silence of a world that feels simultaneously near and impossibly distant. Those moments, raw and unfiltered, were perhaps the most telling, a reminder that beneath the public figure was a human being grappling with profound uncertainty, disappointment, and a sense of being systematically cut off from the very place he had always considered home. Even in the midst of these personal struggles, the court's decision was rippling outward in ways Harry could not fully control. Public discourse intensified, political analysts debated the implications, and global audiences weighed in with commentary that ranged from supportive to scathing. The narrative was shifting, morphing, and evolving at a pace that made it nearly impossible to predict. And every day brought the possibility of new developments, another ruling, a leaked document, a public statement, a change in internal palace dynamics. In such an environment, stability was elusive, and strategy became a daily necessity. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, the tension within the palace walls is palpable. Secrets are whispered, alliances quietly formed, and betrayals, subtle but potent, begin to emerge. Harry is navigating a labyrinth of political maneuvering, emotional strain, and strategic decision-making, all while contending with the public narrative that increasingly defines his story. The stakes could not be higher. One misstep could amplify isolation, one misjudged comment could trigger media firestorms, and one unseen maneuver within the palace could change everything. And just as he begins to consider the next move, an unexpected signal arrives, a cryptic message from an insider, hinting that not everything is as settled as it seems. There are forces at play that even Harry's advisors have not accounted for, and their impact could either open doors previously thought sealed or push him further into exile. But what came next would expose the hidden battles behind the palace walls, and the truth was far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The moment the court's ruling became public, the world erupted. Headlines flashed across screens in every corner of the globe. Prince Harry barred from UK forever, royal rift widens, exiled or protected. The Duke's fate. Social media exploded with comments, memes, and debates, each post adding fuel to an already roaring fire. For Harry, the intensity of the public reaction was almost surreal. He had faced scrutiny before, yes, tabloids, paparazzi, relentless questioning, but nothing compared to the tidal wave that followed this ruling. Every device he touched pinged with notifications. Every news alert seemed designed to remind him of what he had lost. And yet, the real shock was not just the volume of coverage, but the sheer variety of narratives forming around him. Supporters rallied online, expressing outrage at what they saw as an unfair and punitive measure. They posted heartfelt messages. "He belongs here. This is cruel. Family or institution. How can you choose to block him?" Conversely, critics argued that the ruling was necessary, even just. Some painted Harry as someone who had voluntarily stepped away from royal duties, suggesting that legal and social consequences were inevitable. The polarization was stark, creating a global spectacle in which Harry found himself both hero and villain, victim and provocateur. Imagine waking up each day to see the story of your life dissected, debated, and judged by millions who have never truly known you. That was Harry's reality. Every tweet, every opinion piece, every broadcast segment carried the potential to alter public perception. Every nuance of his character, every past action, and every word he had spoken became ammunition in a debate he did not choose but could not escape. The court's ruling was merely the spark. The public discourse was the wildfire consuming everything around it. And yet, Harry had always understood the power of media, for better or worse. He knew that public opinion could be shaped, molded, and, at times, manipulated. He had experienced firsthand how stories could be twisted, contexts distorted, and meanings shifted to serve narratives beyond his control. Now, faced with the ruling and the subsequent global frenzy, he realized that controlling perception would require every ounce of strategy, insight, and emotional resilience he could muster. But even strategy has limits when the narrative is moving faster than the facts. One of the more surprising aspects of the media storm was the sheer unpredictability of international reactions. Leaders, commentators, and citizens from around the world weighed in. Some countries framed the ruling as a stark reminder of the importance of tradition and law. Others saw it as a tale of human struggle, sympathy, and exile. For Harry, the diversity of perspectives was both comforting and disorienting. It underscored a truth he had long known. No single narrative dominates globally, but in the noise, meaning can be lost. And as the cacophony of opinions grew louder, it became harder to discern who truly understood his situation and who was simply projecting their assumptions onto it. The media frenzy was also relentless in digging into Harry's past, searching for context, precedent, and scandal. Every interview he had ever given, every public appearance he had made, every charitable project he had launched was scrutinized and reinterpreted. Analysts dissected his motives, his choices, and even his emotions, attempting to frame them within a storyline that often felt foreign to the man himself. It was a reminder of the power and cruelty of fame. Public figures exist in a double reality, one private, one public, and the two often clash with devastating intensity. For Harry, the collision had arrived in full force. And then there was the human element of the story, the personal cost that no headline could truly capture. Friends, colleagues, and allies reached out privately, offering support, guidance, and counsel. But even in these interactions, Harry felt the weight of caution. Conversations were measured, advice was careful, and every word was filtered through the lens of potential consequence. The isolation imposed by the ruling extended beyond geography and law. It seeped into social and emotional realms, shaping interactions, decisions, and trust. The people he counted on were there, but not fully, because the implications of association with him were suddenly magnified. The ruling also forced Harry to reconsider his own narrative in the public eye. How does a man whose life has been dissected daily reclaim agency over the story being told? How does he convey truth while navigating legal restrictions, family sensitivities, and global scrutiny? These questions were not theoretical. They demanded action. Harry began planning measured responses, media engagements, and philanthropic announcements that could reinforce his image, assert his agency, and remind the world that despite the court's limitations, he remained active, relevant, and committed to his causes. Yet each step required careful calculation. One misstep could reignite controversy, distort public perception, or even exacerbate tensions within the palace. But the story did not end with strategy alone. Emotional reality crept in, unbidden and uncompromising. Harry experienced profound loneliness, frustration, and a sense of being cut off from the country that had shaped his identity. The ruling had not merely restricted travel. It had disrupted connection to family, to history, to heritage, to the very air of a homeland. The weight of absence was almost tangible. Even the mundane things, the memories of walking streets he once knew, the smell of gardens he once visited, the cadence of local voices, became reminders of doors now closed. And while he projected resilience to the public in private, the pain of exclusion was raw and immediate. Then came another twist, a surge of public speculation about the internal dynamics of the royal family. Analysts and commentators began theorizing about why the ruling had been so decisive. Some suggested it was an attempt to assert authority, to maintain tradition, or to control media narratives. Others speculated about deeper personal conflicts, tensions between siblings, or strategic moves designed to protect certain legacies. For Harry, reading these interpretations was both fascinating and frustrating. Some were accurate, many were wildly off base. But collectively, they created a relentless backdrop of pressure, a constant hum of public opinion that shaped every decision, every word, and every emotional response. And then came the unexpected element, support from unexpected quarters. Individuals, groups, and international figures who rarely spoke on matters of royal protocol expressed sympathy, understanding, or advocacy for Harry's situation. These gestures were small but meaningful, reminding him that influence, loyalty, and validation do not always reside in proximity or tradition. Even as the UK felt increasingly distant, the world beyond its borders offered both hope and a platform. Yet these gestures also carried risk. Associations, statements, and engagements could inflame critics, fuel headlines, and complicate relationships within the monarchy. By the end of this chapter, the picture was clear. Harry was navigating a maelstrom of legal limitation, public scrutiny, and emotional upheaval. Every day brought new challenges. Every conversation carried hidden stakes, and every decision could reverberate in unexpected ways. Yet amidst the chaos, a glimmer of strategy, resilience, and determination persisted. And just as the media storm reached its peak, a revelation emerged, a detail previously unnoticed that had the potential to shift public perception and palace dynamics alike. But what exactly this revelation was, and how it would affect Harry's path forward, remained a mystery. One thing was certain: the story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to reveal truths that would shock both the public and the palace alike. The palace, for all its grandeur and centuries of tradition, had always been a place of controlled appearances. Publicly, events unfolded with elegance, ceremony, and poise. Privately, however, every gesture, every glance, and every whispered conversation carried meaning far beyond what outsiders could perceive. And now, with the court's ruling barring Harry from returning to the UK, those private dynamics were reaching a breaking point. It began subtly. A delayed reply here, a missed handshake there, a carefully neutral statement in place of warmth. For Harry, these were not minor oversights. They were signals. Imagine walking into a room where every smile is measured, every word weighed, and every interaction carries the invisible pressure of centuries of hierarchy. The subtle fractures in family relationships, which may have existed for years, suddenly widened under the weight of legal authority and public scrutiny. And Harry, once confident in his place within this structure, began to feel the isolation acutely. Family dinners, ceremonial appearances, and even casual interactions became exercises in caution. Conversations that might once have been light and playful were now laden with unspoken tension. Who could be trusted to speak candidly? Who had been swayed by the court's ruling or by internal palace politics? Every exchange required calculation. Every word had the potential to inflame rumors, and every silence could be interpreted as judgment. For Harry, navigating these fractured relationships required the same precision he had once applied to public engagements. But now the stakes were profoundly personal. And then came the most painful moments, the unspoken rules around connection. Invitations were carefully curated, attendance at events became conditional, and opportunities for genuine familial interaction were limited by layers of protocol, discretion, and control. Imagine being part of a family, yet consistently reminded that you are, in practice, on the outside. The emotional toll was immense. Harry had spent years balancing his personal desires with public duty, but the court's ruling and the palace's subtle reinforcement of boundaries created a sense of exclusion that was difficult to reconcile with love or loyalty. In the midst of this tension, Harry began to notice subtle maneuvers by certain family members. Gestures that seemed supportive on the surface were layered with caution, and smiles sometimes concealed judgment. Advisors and courtiers, too, became players in a silent game of influence, weighing loyalty against strategy, affection against obligation. It was a labyrinthine environment where intentions were rarely clear and consequences could be severe. Harry, seasoned in public life, but human nonetheless, had to navigate not only his own emotions, but also the undercurrents of a family system that had suddenly become unpredictable. The emotional complexity of this period cannot be overstated. On one hand, Harry remained deeply committed to his family, understanding that bonds formed over a lifetime do not dissolve overnight. On the other hand, the reality of exclusion, both legal and social, forced him to confront painful truths about the fragility of connection. How do you maintain affection when proximity is denied? How do you preserve trust when decisions are made without your input? And how do you reconcile public loyalty with private estrangement? These were questions that haunted him, demanding both reflection and action. Meanwhile, rumors of behind-the-scenes disagreements within the palace began to circulate. Some family members reportedly questioned the severity of the ruling, arguing that it was unnecessarily harsh and emotionally damaging. Others maintained that the decision was justified, emphasizing duty, tradition, and the protection of the institution. These internal conflicts, invisible to the public eye, created a complex environment in which every word, every gesture, and every decision could shift alliances or deepen divides. For Harry, observing these undercurrents was both illuminating and disheartening. It revealed the depth of complexity within the family, but also underscored the isolation imposed by the ruling. In parallel, Harry's own strategy began to evolve. Recognizing the limitations imposed by geography and law, he sought alternative avenues for influence, engagement, and personal connection. Virtual meetings, global philanthropic initiatives, and carefully orchestrated media appearances became tools to maintain relevance and agency. Yet even these measures were constrained by the palace's subtle oversight and the relentless gaze of the public. Every success was shadowed by the knowledge that proximity, access, and familial intimacy were restricted, a constant reminder that influence does not always equal connection. At the same time, emotional vulnerability began to surface in unexpected ways. Private moments of reflection, conversations with close allies, and candid exchanges with advisors revealed the depth of Harry's frustration, disappointment, and longing. Imagine sitting alone in a room late at night, surrounded by reminders of a life that once felt secure, and confronting the reality that doors you assumed were open are now closed. It is a human experience, raw and unfiltered, yet one compounded by the weight of public attention and legal limitation. And yet, amidst the tension and isolation, glimmers of hope emerged. Allies within the palace who had previously remained neutral began offering discreet support, signaling that not all relationships were irreparably fractured. These small gestures, a message, a meeting, a quiet word of encouragement, provided both reassurance and strategic opportunity. They reminded Harry that even within rigid institutions, influence, connection, and empathy can survive, provided one navigates carefully and wisely. However, just as these moments of hope began to surface, a new layer of tension emerged. A dispute over public messaging, strategic initiatives, or media engagements revealed that not all allies were aligned. Differences in priorities, approach, and perspective became apparent, creating a situation in which Harry had to balance personal values with strategic necessity. One wrong move could exacerbate existing fractures, miscommunicate intentions, or spark a public controversy. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was narrow. As Chapter 4 draws to a close, the palace emerges as both a stage and a battleground. Emotional bonds, legal realities, and strategic considerations intersect in ways that are both subtle and profound. Harry stands at the center of a network of relationships under strain, observing, calculating, and responding, aware that the next interaction could either mend fractures or deepen isolation. Every glance, every word, every action carries weight, and the consequences extend far beyond the immediate moment. And then, just as tensions seemed to peak, a revelation arrived that no one, not the public, not advisors, not even Harry, anticipated. A message, a document, a signal of intent within the palace walls hinted at a decision that could either restore connection or enforce further separation. Its implications were immediate and potentially catastrophic. But what came next would redefine the dynamics within the family. And no one could have predicted the shockwaves that would ripple from that single, unexpected development. The court's ruling had done more than block Harry's return to the UK. It had thrust him into a labyrinth of legal, logistical, and emotional complexities. Legal documents, clauses, and precedents filled the room like an impenetrable fog, each paragraph carrying consequences that could ripple for years. For someone who had spent much of life in the public eye, where image and narrative often overshadowed technicalities, this was a new battlefield, one where every misstep could carry legal, emotional, and reputational costs. From the moment the ruling was finalized, Harry's legal team went into overdrive. Imagine a room filled with lawyers, advisors, and strategists, poring over every line of text, searching for ambiguities, loopholes, or precedents that might allow for a reversal, mitigation, or at least temporary relief. Each clause was dissected meticulously, Every word was weighed for its implication. Every past ruling, every royal precedent, every nuance of UK law became ammunition in a battle that felt simultaneously urgent and exhausting. But law is rarely simple, especially when intertwined with centuries-old traditions, institutional authority, and public scrutiny. Harry discovered quickly that legal options were constrained not only by the letter of the law, but also by public perception and institutional resistance. A technically valid argument could still falter if it appeared to challenge the monarchy's authority or disrupt the carefully maintained narrative of royal protocol. Strategy required not only legal precision, but political insight and emotional intelligence. This was further complicated by timing. The court's ruling had introduced deadlines, conditions, and potential triggers that limited flexibility. Advisors debated constantly. Should they challenge the ruling immediately, risking public backlash? Should they negotiate quietly behind the scenes, hoping for a more discreet resolution? Or should Harry wait, consolidating influence and public support before taking the next step? Each option carried risk, and the pressure was immense. In such a high-stakes environment, even minor errors could spiral into crises that would dominate headlines worldwide. And then there was the human element, the emotional toll of being trapped in a legal maze. Harry was no stranger to pressure, but navigating a system designed to limit his movement, restrict his agency, and publicly define his role created a unique strain. The isolation was both literal and symbolic. The law had drawn boundaries around his body, his relationships, and his access to the country he had once called home. And as he studied the legal documents day after day, he couldn't escape the emotional weight. Each paragraph, each clause, was a reminder that the doors of his homeland were not merely closed, but actively barred. Yet Harry was not passive. He began formulating a multi-pronged strategy, balancing legal action with public engagement, media positioning, and international diplomacy. Virtual meetings became strategic war rooms. Advisors coordinated around the clock, assessing potential risks and outcomes. Media consultants analyzed headlines, public sentiment, and social media trends. Every move was calculated, every statement considered, every action weighed against a complex matrix of legal and emotional factors. It was a chess game played on multiple boards simultaneously, and every piece mattered. Surprising insights emerged during this period. For instance, some clauses in the ruling hinted at flexibility under certain conditions, though exercising that flexibility could trigger intense scrutiny. Other provisions seemed to anticipate attempts at circumvention, creating a legal trap for even minor miscalculations. Harry and his advisors had to navigate these subtleties carefully, recognizing that even a technically correct maneuver could be interpreted as defiance, insubordination, or disregard for tradition. The stakes were extraordinary. Amid this intense strategizing, Harry also confronted the personal implications. The ruling affected not only his access to the UK, but also relationships, family dynamics, and long-term planning. How do you plan meaningful engagement with a country when your physical presence is legally restricted? How do you maintain influence without overstepping boundaries? And perhaps most poignantly, how do you reconcile ambition and responsibility with the reality of exclusion and distance? These were questions without simple answers, demanding creativity, patience, and resilience. The legal maze also intersected with the media narrative in unpredictable ways. Every move, every statement, and every rumor was dissected and interpreted, often inaccurately. Social media speculation ran wild. Some predicted imminent reconciliation, others feared permanent estrangement. Analysts debated potential legal strategies, predicting whether Harry could circumvent the ruling or whether the court's decision was unassailable. In this environment, perception could be as powerful as reality, and managing both simultaneously became a critical component of his strategy. Then, just when the legal battle seemed like an insurmountable wall, an unexpected development arrived, a potential opening, hidden within the text of the ruling itself. A clause, previously overlooked, suggested a path forward. Not a complete reversal, but a conditional measure that could allow Harry to navigate around certain restrictions under specific circumstances. The discovery sent ripples through his team. Hope mixed with caution. It was an opportunity, yes, but one fraught with risk. Any misstep could backfire, amplifying scrutiny and complicating relationships with the palace. Harry now faced a choice: act boldly and risk escalating tension, or proceed cautiously and risk losing momentum. Every advisor had a different perspective, every precedent suggested a different path, and every public reaction had to be anticipated. The pressure was immense. It was a reminder that, in this situation, legal expertise alone was insufficient. Emotional intelligence, strategic foresight, and careful timing were equally critical. At the same time, Harry had to manage the emotional fallout within his immediate circle. Close confidants, allies, and family members abroad were deeply concerned. They witnessed his frustration, isolation, and determination firsthand. Their advice, support, and occasionally dissenting opinions shaped the decisions he made. But even those relationships carried tension. How much influence should friends and advisors have? How do you balance personal loyalty with strategic necessity? These questions added another layer of complexity to an already intricate puzzle. By the end of this chapter, the picture was stark. Harry was navigating a multidimensional maze of law, media, family dynamics, and personal emotion. Every day brought new challenges. Every decision carried extraordinary weight, and every move could trigger consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Yet, even amid the pressure, a glimmer of potential opportunity emerged, a thread that, if handled correctly, might allow him to regain some measure of control, influence, and connection. But just as he prepared to take the next calculated step, a twist arrived, a revelation about the ruling itself, hidden in plain sight, that could either open doors previously thought sealed or create obstacles more formidable than anyone had anticipated. What came next would test not only Harry's legal acumen, but his emotional resilience, strategic foresight, and capacity to navigate a world where law, family, and public perception intersect in unpredictable ways. While the UK court ruling had trapped Harry within a maze of legal and familial constraints, it had also thrust him onto a global stage. Suddenly, his story was no longer just a domestic matter. It had become international news. Every continent, every major media outlet, and every influential figure seemed to weigh in, offering commentary, support, or criticism. The ruling, though geographic in scope, had consequences that spanned oceans, cultures, and public opinion. Harry was now navigating a world where legal, emotional, and reputational stakes were all magnified by the global spotlight. The first wave of international reaction came from political leaders and public figures who rarely comment on royal affairs. Some expressed concern over the human cost of the ruling, emphasizing the emotional toll of barring a man from his homeland and his family. Others framed the situation as a lesson in duty, protocol, and the limits of privilege. These opinions, though diverse, had one effect. They heightened the visibility of Harry's situation and placed subtle pressure on the palace to justify its actions. For the first time, the world was scrutinizing not just Harry, but the institution itself, creating a dynamic in which perception, legitimacy, and public sympathy all intersected. Social media, of course, acted as both amplifier and battleground. Millions of users around the world debated, criticized, and empathized with Harry's plight. Hashtags surged, trending topics erupted, and online communities mobilized to discuss every aspect of the story, from the court's decision to the potential long-term consequences for the monarchy. For Harry, the sheer scale of attention was both empowering and overwhelming. It provided a platform to maintain relevance and influence, but also ensured that every misstep, every comment, and every move would be analyzed and scrutinized worldwide. Amid this global attention, Harry's team recognized a unique opportunity to leverage international support to strengthen his position. Strategic partnerships, philanthropic initiatives, and media engagements became tools not merely for influence, but for signaling resilience, authority, and global impact. Each initiative was carefully planned to maximize visibility while avoiding conflicts with the UK court ruling or palace expectations. It was a delicate balance. Act too aggressively and risk inflaming controversy. Act too passively and lose momentum entirely. But global attention was a double-edged sword. While allies emerged in unexpected quarters, so did adversaries. Critics questioned Harry's motives, interpreted his actions as calculated, or suggested that his estrangement from the UK was self-inflicted. Tabloids across continents ran with sensationalized headlines, framing him alternately as a victim, a rebel, or a figure of scandal. Even well-meaning commentary could be twisted into narratives that complicated his strategic and emotional objectives. The world had an insatiable appetite for royal drama, and Harry's every move became material for global speculation. Yet in this chaos, Harry found subtle but significant opportunities. International allies, leaders, celebrities, and philanthropists offered platforms, resources, and guidance. These relationships were carefully cultivated, each selected not only for visibility but for strategic alignment. Some offered access to initiatives that could bolster his charitable work. Others provided media channels to reach audiences that understood nuance, context, and complexity. The calculus was intricate. Every engagement carried potential benefits, but also the risk of misinterpretation. Strategy, timing, and emotional intelligence became inseparable tools in navigating this new, global battlefield. At the same time, the emotional toll of global scrutiny was profound. Harry was living in a paradoxical reality. Celebrated by some, criticized by others, isolated by law, yet constantly observed. Every private interaction, every personal reflection, every effort to plan a life beyond the UK was shadowed by public awareness. Imagine the strain of negotiating not only legal barriers, but also the weight of global perception. Every miscalculation could reverberate for years, influencing everything from media narratives to familial dynamics. The pressure was relentless, and then came the twists. Leaks, rumors, and subtle signals that suggested internal palace politics were reacting to international attention. Advisors reported that certain factions were concerned about optics, fearing that global sympathy for Harry could undermine the monarchy's image. Others argued for discretion, emphasizing tradition and the need to avoid public confrontation. Harry, navigating both the legal maze and global opinion, realized that every move had consequences not just in the UK, but across continents. Influence was no longer simply about action. It was about timing, perception, and control. The stakes were further heightened by unexpected developments. Whispers of potential allies within the UK establishment who were sympathetic to Harry's position. Though constrained by law, these individuals could influence public perception, advocate for strategic adjustments, or provide channels for indirect engagement. Their involvement was subtle, confidential, and critical, an invisible network that could shift momentum at pivotal moments. But their loyalty, influence, and motivations were complex, leaving Harry and his advisors constantly evaluating whether opportunities were genuine or fraught with hidden risk. And then there were the adversaries. Media outlets, palace officials, and political commentators carefully scrutinized every move, looking for evidence of overreach, defiance, or strategic misstep. Every public statement, every engagement, every philanthropic initiative could be interpreted as provocation or manipulation. The line between asserting influence and inciting controversy was razor-thin, and Harry had to navigate it with precision. Misjudgment could lead to negative headlines, public backlash, and further isolation. Amid these challenges, Harry began reflecting on a deeper reality. The interplay between law, family, and public perception had shifted irrevocably. Even with allies abroad, even with platforms for influence, the legal restriction remained a constant, unyielding barrier. The ruling had created both distance and urgency. Distance, because the UK itself was inaccessible. Urgency, because the global spotlight meant that every decision, even those made abroad, would resonate within the palace and among the public. It was a high-stakes balancing act that tested strategy, patience, and emotional resilience simultaneously. As Chapter 6 draws to a close, the global stage emerges as both opportunity and challenge. Allies and adversaries intersect, public perception amplifies every decision, and Harry stands at the center of a complex web of legal, familial, and international pressures. Every move matters. Every statement carries weight. Every delay risks losing momentum. And in this environment, one unexpected revelation has the potential to shift everything. To redefine alliances, recalibrate strategy, and change the course of a saga that has captivated the world. But just as he prepared to act on this emerging opportunity, a shocking development arrived, one that threatened to undermine everything and force decisions faster than anyone could anticipate. The world watched, and Harry had no choice but to respond. The court's ruling had done more than block Harry's return to the UK. It had handed the global media a narrative ready to be twisted, sensationalized, and dissected endlessly. Headlines around the world screamed with words designed to provoke. Prince Harry exiled forever. Royal rift deepens. A family divided. Social media exploded with speculation, opinions, and heated debates. For Harry, the struggle had shifted from legal battles to narrative battles, a fight for control over the story of his own life. From the moment news broke, it was clear that the media was operating independently of facts. Tweets, posts, and articles distilled complex legal rulings into shocking soundbites. Context disappeared. Nuance was replaced with outrage. Some outlets framed him as a tragic victim, others as a defiant rebel, and a few painted him as a reckless provocateur. For someone whose life had always been under public scrutiny, this was nothing new. Yet the stakes were higher than ever. Every misinterpretation could inflame critics, mislead the public, and influence the monarchy's internal response. Imagine waking up to find that the world has decided who you are before you have spoken a word. That was Harry's reality. Every move he made, every public appearance he planned, every statement he issued had to anticipate not only the intended audience, but also the ways it could be distorted. It was a high-stakes game where perception often mattered more than reality. Misstep, misquote, or delay, any could lead to headlines that amplified isolation, fueled gossip, and heightened tension with the palace. And the scale was overwhelming. Global news cycles moved at lightning speed. Reports spread across multiple continents, translated into different languages, and reframed according to cultural context. Within hours, commentary ranged from sympathetic to critical, from analytical to outright speculative.